welcome Kristian Hoysradt.
Thank you so much. Good to see so many of you and so many familiar faces. I am based here in NAR's Washington, D.C. office. I serve on a team of 6 political representatives, which cover different geographical areas across the country. And so I report directly to Shannon McGann, who is our Chief Advocacy Officer and runs our DC office. Normally I would be flying around speaking with you all in person, but for the last year I've been here at my kitchen table speaking to state and local associations about our federal advocacy work, over the last year. So first, I just want to kind of go over what I plan to cover today. I'm just going to go through this PowerPoint, as quickly as I can, and then open it up for questions from folks. But in terms of what I plan to touch upon, just want to give you kind of an update on what the political landscape looks like here, what's actually happening in DC currently. I'll also talk about President Biden's 2 big pieces of legislation. One that is currently pending and was just introduced yesterday, the American Jobs Plan. And I'll also touch about what was included within the American Rescue Plan, or the COVID relief package, that had the most impact on realtors and the real estate industry. I'll touch upon 2 recent extensions to federal programs, one, the Paycheck Protection Program, as well as the federal Eviction Moratorium. And then I'll finish by touching on a couple other priorities that NAR will be pursuing on Capitol Hill throughout this session. So first, just a quick update and reminder about the political landscape in DC. It is quite divided. Democrats do hold the White House and both chambers of Congress. However, the chambers in Congress are nearly evenly divided. We've got a 50-50 split in the Senate, where Vice President Harris will cast tie-breaking votes, which is why the Democrats have majority control in that chamber. And then in the House of Representatives, the Democrats have just a 9-seat majority. There are 5 vacant seats right now. Special elections are going to be held over the next few months, but most of those 5 vacant seats are pretty solid. I think 3 are solidly Democrat, 2 are solidly Republican. So we count on this 9-seat margin manifesting itself once those special elections are done. And so there is not much room to spare for the Democratic majorities, as you may call them, in these chambers. And so that means that we are in the midst of a political environment where compromise is top of mind on any piece of legislation. And fortunately for realtors in the real estate industry, home ownership and housing are those areas where legislators tend to find the most bipartisanship. So again, we're going to see a divided Congress here, but unlike I think past Congresses where we saw gridlock, this Congress, it looks like we are starting to see some things moving in the midst of different type of parliamentary kind of maneuvers that the Democrats are going to take, which I'll talk about here in a little bit. So first, I just want to tell you about today, just two quick things. One, this is a look at President Biden's cabinet. Among his cabinet members, you have, of course, your former Senator Kamala Harris as his VP, as well as your former Congressman and Attorney General for California, Xavier Becerra, who is now the HHS Secretary. You also have Isabel Guzman, who was the director of the California Small Business Advocate, has now been promoted and appointed by President Biden as the administrator of the Small Business Administration. And I'll also just note that our new Housing and Urban Development Secretary, or HUD Secretary, Marcia Fudge, was confirmed. So President Biden now has a fully confirmed cabinet, and they are meeting for the first time today in Washington. So that's some of the bigger news that you'll hear coming out of DC today. I'll also note that Vice President Harris, as I understand it, is actually flying to California today. I think she's going to be in Los Angeles and Oakland, selling the American Rescue Plan, which was just passed by Congress as introduced by President Biden just a few weeks ago. And I'm sure she'll also be in the process of selling their new initiative as well, which is the American Jobs Plan, which was introduced yesterday. Off the bat, though, I just want to point out that out of the gate, when President Biden was sworn in January, he did issue a few executive orders which impact the housing industry. So I just wanted to, and our members. So I just wanted to point those out real quick. Out of the gate, he had initially extended the federal eviction moratorium through March 31st. The CDC last week, on direction by President Biden, went ahead and extended that moratorium through June 3rd. I'm going to touch on that in just a few minutes here, take a little bit of a deeper dive in terms of NAR's advocacy work and pushing back against the moratorium. President Biden also issued a forbearance and foreclosure moratorium on federally guaranteed mortgages, initially through March 31st, again, extended through June 30th. And then just for people's awareness, the forbearance on student loans has been extended through September 30th, which of course impacts our members as well as prospective buyers in terms of, having enough savings to put down that down payment. So those are just a few of the executive orders to be aware of. And now I'm going to talk about kind of really what is the hot topic here in Washington, and that's infrastructure. Yesterday, President Biden introduced the American Jobs Plan, which is a $2 trillion infrastructure package. This package has been something that has been really talked about, I think, I think since President Trump had come into office. We were always awaiting what we had been told was Infrastructure Week. Infrastructure Week was coming, that a big bill was coming. It was going to be introduced. And in the last administration, this just got further bumped down the priority list. In this new administration, infrastructure looks to be coming to, or an investment in infrastructure looks to be coming to fruition. And so, as I mentioned, it's a $2 trillion package. And within this package, you have a number of provisions related to housing. And I can tell you that in NAR's conversations with members of Congress, with the Biden administration, our message to them is that housing equals infrastructure. And it would seem, at least, that the Biden administration received that message. As I'll go through a couple of these housing provisions that were included. But I do just want to preface this by saying that the American Jobs Plan is introduced by President Biden yesterday. It is a framework. Congress has the job of kind of figuring out the meats and potatoes of the bill, but this is the framework that President Biden is kind of laying out for Congress, and then and kind of expecting Congress to fill in the blanks. But at the end of the day, it will be the Senate and the House of Representatives who kind of really get into the details here. So broadly speaking, though, President Biden's plan does call for $213 billion to produce, preserve, and retrofit more than 2 million affordable and energy efficient electrified housing units across the country. That is the largest investment in housing infrastructure that we've seen, I think, perhaps ever. The plan also calls for $20 billion in tax credits over the next 5 years for building and rehabbing more than 500,000 homes for low and middle income home buyers. The plan also calls for the elimination of exclusionary zoning laws, such as minimum lot sizes, mandatory parking requirements, and prohibitions on multifamily housing. His plan also calls on Congress to create innovative and new competitive grant programs to award flexible and attractive funding for jurisdictions that take concrete steps to eliminate such needless, zoning barriers, or, depending on who you talk to. I'm quoting this from his plan, but such needless barriers to producing affordable housing. So essentially, he's calling on Congress to create some kind of an incentivization program to get localities to change their zoning laws to allow for more housing production. We also have seen a provision in there for $40 billion in investment to improve public housing infrastructure, which is certainly the most money we've seen put forth as an investment in public housing, which is known to be somewhat lacking in upgrades and that type of thing. And then finally, in terms of the plan overall, NAR also likes the inclusion of $100 billion for high-speed broadband deployment. NAR has, for a long time, advocated for the expansion of broadband internet, especially into rural and underserved areas. And with the COVID pandemic, at this point, broadband isn't a luxury. It's a necessity. It's a necessary utility that we need to expand across this country. And so we certainly like the idea of that included in the plan. So where does this go from here? As I mentioned, Vice President Harris, she's on the road, going to be selling this plan at stops and rallies across the country. President Biden is going to hit the road doing the same thing. Congress, as I said, is going to have to fill in the details. What's its possibility of passage? Well, from what we can tell, Republicans are hesitant out of the gate to support many of the provisions included in this bill, including the means by which you pay for this bill, which does include tax increases on corporations. So that seems to be a bit of a non-starter on their end. But as I mentioned, Democrats might be employing some parliamentary maneuvers here to try and get this bill through Congress. And so I don't want to get too much into the weeds, but you probably heard kind of the back and forth on the news with regard to the infrastructure, or excuse me, with regard to the COVID relief bill in the Senate, which is split 50-50. Typically, you need 60 votes of the 100 to overcome what's called cloture and to avoid what's called a filibuster. And so what that does is it kind of requires consensus from both sides of the aisle. And so with Democrats holding 50 votes, you would typically require at least 10 Republicans to come on board in order to pass a bill. However, there is this thing called budget reconciliation, and it's a parliamentary maneuver that allows for the Senate to pass legislation related to the budget and related to kind of federal funding that helps the party in power avoid the filibuster. And so everything included in this American Jobs Plan is related to federal funding and the budget. And so the expectation is if Republicans remain hesitant to come on board with this bill, that Democrats will simply move forward in passing the American Jobs Plan through this parliamentary process called reconciliation. And so with that, whether Republicans come on board or not, it is expected among political observers here in DC that the American Jobs Plan probably has a pretty good chance of becoming law here within the next month or two. So that's kind of where we're at in terms of like the hot topic, the infrastructure package. Now I'm just going to take a step back and talk about some of the things that have happened over the last couple of weeks. Though I do want to touch on quickly the American Rescue Plan, which I'm sure you all are familiar with. This was the COVID relief bill that was the first priority of the Biden administration. This was the $1.19 trillion relief package, which included the $1,400 stimulus checks. It extended the pandemic unemployment assistance program through September 6th, which of course realtors have been eligible for as independent contractors since the start of COVID and the creation of the program under the CARES Act last March. It also includes an exclusion of up to $10,200 in unemployment compensation from taxation for those with an AGI of $150,000 or less, beginning in this past tax year. So that's important for anyone who has benefited from the pandemic unemployment assistance over the last year. And then as NAR has been advocating for throughout the last year since the pandemic began, we were able to secure another almost $22 billion in new money for rental assistance, on top of the $25 billion that we were able to secure in the December COVID relief bill. So we almost have we have close to $50 billion that we've been able to secure in rental assistance to help our mom and pop landlords and housing providers across the country who, of course, are suffering under the impact of the federal eviction moratorium. Just a couple other provisions that were included to be aware of. The American Rescue Plan also expanded paid sick and family leave through September 30th. There was a $10 billion allocation for a housing assistance fund that will allow state housing finance agencies to help homeowners with COVID hardships, including that of helping pay make their mortgage payments, etc. The states are handling the distribution of that money. There was $100 million included for housing counseling services, $15 billion for new small business grants, $350 billion in state and local aid, and $130 billion for schools, primarily to get schools reopened and retrofitted to reopen, in the midst of the pandemic. So that was the rescue plan. I think it was the last week or so, we've had two major extensions to federal programs. One was an extension of the Paycheck Protection Program. As a refresher, this is the program and the legislation this is the program that provided for the SBA's PPP loans as created under the CARES Act. The legislation that was just passed by Congress last week extended the PPP program through May 31st. It was set to expire yesterday, March 31st, and it does allow businesses more time to pursue a second PPP loan if they already took one out prior. If eligible businesses or organizations, because 501c6 organizations are eligible, such as state and local realtor associations, the SBA will permit lenders an additional 30 days to process and approve any outstanding applications. So essentially, we bought more time for anyone who might need a first or second PPP loan. In terms of those who might be going for a second one, just a reminder about the eligibility criteria. If a business applies for a PPP loan, they have to have only used that first PPP loan, obviously, for authorized uses. The applicant can employ no more than 300 people, and they have to demonstrate at least a 25% reduction in revenue between comparable quarters over 2019 and 2020. So that's the PPP, the latest on PPP, and now we have the federal eviction moratorium, which of course is a hot topic right now. So the CDC eviction moratorium was extended through June 30th, as prescribed by President Biden. And so, NAR has really been at the forefront of this issue from the beginning. Since last March, NAR has been adamant in our communication with Congress and both the Trump and Biden administration that any eviction moratorium to protect renters should be limited in time and scope and targeted to those who demonstrate the need, and must provide relief as well for housing providers who are impacted by the loss of rent. And so we obviously don't want to put people on the streets, but there needs to be a recognition that housing providers are suffering because of this, and they need assistance too. And so that's kind of been our message from the start. We have had face-to-face or Zoom-to-Zoom conversations with members of both the Trump and Biden administrations, as well as members of Congress, members of the Senate, as well as staffers for the Treasury Department, the CDC, and HUD. They're well aware of our priorities, and that's part of the reason why we were able to secure $25 billion in December for housing providers and another $22 billion in this latest COVID relief bill. And, just to give you an idea of just how adamant and unyielding we've been, we have provided over 30 letters and communications with feedback and comments and instructions to Congress and both administrations on the eviction moratorium. And again, providing updated data and emphasis on the need for federal rental assistance for our mom and pop landlords and housing providers. So that's kind of where we're at in terms of where the CDC stands and what we've been doing in terms of communicating with the administration and Congress. In addition to our advocacy work on that side of things, there is also pending litigation moving through the courts. And so we are engaged with litigation brought by state realtor associations regarding the eviction moratorium. We've been actively involved in supporting legal action filed by both the Alabama and Georgia Association of Realtors, plus two housing providers, in seeking a nationwide injunction against the CDC order. We've also, to kind of just, again, as the leading advocacy organization on real estate, we have provided kind of data on the national impact that this federal eviction moratorium is creating. And so we submitted a declaration illustrating the economic impact of the eviction moratorium and unpaid rent nationwide. And so that case has actually now moved into the federal district court of the District of Columbia. And so we have been supporting both the Georgia and Alabama realtor associations as they argue against the legality of the CDC order and the eviction moratorium, and have helped them in outlining kind of these 4 points in terms of, how it basically, violates what we consider federal law. And so we expect a decision in this case very soon. I will just, note that, as we've seen in some other district court cases, the decisions have been limited in scope, sometimes just to the plaintiffs, sometimes just to renters and landlords within the district court itself. Of course, any decision is eligible for appeal. So it's not like we expect the eviction moratorium to be lifted tomorrow because of a district court decision. Even if the DC District Court rules in our favor, we are likely going to see a appeal from the Department of Justice, which of course will prolong the case. So just know that we are honestly trying to do everything we can, both on the regulatory front, the political front, and the litigation front, to provide relief to our mom and pop landlords and housing providers across the country. So I'll just wrap up here and leave some time for questions. Just want to point out a few other NAR priorities that we are proactively pursuing here in the 117th Congress. One is we are in active discussions with members of Congress about the importance of 1031 like-kind exchanges. So we had, during the campaign back in 2020, President Biden, then candidate Biden, had talked about how he may consider using the 1031 like-kind exchange program as a pay-for some of his, for some of his legislation, if and or when he became president. We have not heard much talk of that from the administration or from any members of Congress in recent months, but in a proactive manner, we have joined a coalition of real estate organizations, are in the middle of conducting research studies and putting together reports and presenting data and information to key members of Congress and committees to basically just emphasize the importance of the 1031 like-kind exchange program, the fact that 61% of realtors were involved in at least one 1031 transaction between 2016 and 2020. And of course, it's particularly important for the commercial industry, which has been, hardest hit here during the pandemic. So that is just kind of one of the many things we are doing on Capitol Hill, in addition to everything else we've already talked about here. I also wanted to note on the topic of fair housing that NAR still is supportive of the Equality Act, which is known as HR 5, and is the bill that would extend or add sexual orientation and gender identity to the 1964 Civil Rights Act and Fair Housing Act. At this point, from NAR's perspective, we added sexual orientation and gender identity to our code of ethics back in, I think it was 2011 and 2013. So from our standpoint, this is Congress catching up to where we already are. There are 31 states that have already passed these types of protections with regard to housing and other areas. So there are still 29 states where a person can be denied housing because of their sexual orientation or gender identity. Or I think it's 27 states now following a Supreme Court case this past June, which kind of expanded on the definition of sex and how that actually covers gender identity and sexual orientation within the scope of employment. So in any event, it's a little complicated, but bottom line, this is the piece of legislation that extends protections for the LGBTQ community. It has passed the House yet again. It moves on to the Senate. There are disagreements among Democrats and Republicans over some of the religious exemptions that Republicans would like to see included. So until those are worked out, we're not sure where exactly this bill is going to go. But that is something that is an example where legislation that we support has moved through the lower house and is now almost made it to the upper chamber. And then just some broader priorities for us as we finish up here our discussion. NAR, we're just working to improve access to home ownership, whether that is helping close that home ownership gap, which is the largest it's been in decades. Or whether it's, coming up with ways and policies, and incentives to create more supply. Inventory is our biggest issue with right now. I don't need to tell you all that in California, that's the issue. And so, we are certainly trying to come up with ways to incentivize more housing production, whether it's, tax breaks for conversions from commercial to residential, tax breaks for people who convert rentals to residential, that type of thing. It's definitely, items that we are emphasizing in our conversations with members of Congress. We're going to make sure that the relief provisions for COVID are implemented, including the rental assistance. I know the system is a little complicated there in California. States have the right to kind of distribute the assistance as they wish, but we're just trying to make sure that states aren't putting up too many crazy hurdles from getting that funding out there to our mom and pop landlords. And fair housing for all is really top of mind for us in everything we do because of that home ownership gap right now. So I'll stop there.
Well, Thank you very much. We really appreciate your time today.
Thanks, Chris.